Magina River at 2 o'clock in the morning. The water is dark. The sky is almost completely black. A cold wind moves across the Mississippi River as a wooden steamboat slowly pushes its way north. On the decks, thousands of exhausted men are trying to sleep. Many of them are soldiers. They have survived a war. They have survived Confederate prison camps. They have spent months starving, freezing, and wondering if they would ever see their families again. And now, finally, they are going home. For many of these men, the nightmare of the Civil War appears to be over. They are thinking about their wives, their children, their parents, their farms, their hometowns. Some are imagining the first meal they will eat at home. Others are quietly talking with the men beside them, and some are simply trying to sleep. After everything they have endured, home is finally within reach. But beneath their feet, something is terribly wrong. The steamboat is dangerously overcrowded, far beyond what it was designed to carry. And one of its boilers has already experienced serious problems. Still, the journey continues. The passengers have no idea what is waiting for them. Then, in the darkness of April 27th, 1865, everything changes. A tremendous explosion tears through the steamboat. Fire spreads across the decks. Men are thrown into the Mississippi River. Wood and metal rain down around them. The pilot house is destroyed. The ship begins to break apart, and hundreds of people suddenly find themselves trapped between fire and freezing water. By sunrise, one of the worst maritime disasters in American history will have taken place. The name of the ship is Sultana, and today, surprisingly, many people have never heard of it. To understand how this tragedy happened, we have to go back to the final days of the American Civil War. In April of 1865, the United States was exhausted. The Civil War had devastated the country. Cities and towns had been destroyed. Families had been separated. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had died. And after 4 terrible years of fighting, the war was finally coming to an end. Confederate forces were collapsing, Union armies were advancing, and prisoners of war were beginning to be released. For the soldiers who had spent months inside Confederate prison camps, freedom must have felt almost impossible to believe. Many had survived terrible conditions. They were weak, they were sick, some were severely underweight. But they were alive, and now they wanted only one thing: home. The United States government needed to transport thousands of these recently released prisoners back north. One of the routes would take them along the Mississippi River, and that is where the Sultana entered the story. The Sultana was a large wooden side-wheel steamboat. She had been built in Cincinnati, Ohio, and entered service in 1863. The vessel was designed for the Mississippi River trade. She carried passengers, cargo, and military personnel. But the Sultana was never designed to carry anything close to the enormous number of people who would eventually crowd onto her decks. And in late April of 1865, circumstances created an opportunity. For the people operating the steamboat, more passengers meant more money. And for the soldiers waiting at Vicksburg, one thing mattered more than anything else: getting home. At Vicksburg, Mississippi, thousands of recently released Union prisoners were waiting for transportation north. They had already endured some of the worst conditions of the Civil War. Many had spent months inside Confederate prison camps. They were exhausted, they were hungry, and many were seriously ill. But they were finally free. The war was ending. And for these men, the idea of going home was almost too good to believe. Among the steamboats operating along the Mississippi River was the Sultana. When she arrived at Vicksburg, the ship began taking passengers aboard. More and more soldiers crowded onto the vessel. They came aboard carrying whatever few belongings they still had. Some had small bags, some carried blankets. Others had almost nothing, but they all shared the same destination: home. As the number of passengers increased, the decks became more crowded. Men stood shoulder to shoulder. There was barely enough room to move. The Sultana was being loaded far beyond the number of passengers she was normally designed to carry. Historical records give different estimates for the exact number of people aboard. But there is no doubt that the vessel was dangerously overcrowded. According to records preserved by the Library of Congress, the ship was legally allowed to carry only 376 people, yet more than 2,300 people were aboard, according to contemporary accounts and later research. That meant the Sultana was carrying several times more people than her legal capacity. And there was another problem. One of the ship's boilers had developed serious damage. The boiler needed repairs. But repairing the boiler properly would take time, and time was something the passengers did not want to lose. These men had already waited long enough. They wanted to get home. The steamboat operators also had financial reasons to keep moving. Every additional passenger represented additional revenue, and thousands of soldiers were waiting to travel north. The decision was made to continue. The damaged boiler was repaired quickly. The Sultana prepared to leave. For the men aboard, this was a moment of hope. They had survived the war. They had survived imprisonment, and now they were finally moving toward their families. No one standing on those crowded decks could imagine what would happen less than 2 days later. The Sultana began moving north along the Mississippi River. Spring flooding had made the river extremely powerful. The water was high, the current was strong, and navigating the river was difficult. The steamboat pushed forward against the current. Her enormous paddle wheels turned through the dark water. Inside the ship, the boilers worked continuously. Steam pressure built. The passengers rested wherever they could. Some slept on the decks. Some talked quietly. Others thought about the people waiting for them at home. For many of these soldiers, this was supposed to be the final chapter of the war. But beneath them, the machinery continued to work. And inside one of those boilers, pressure was building. The Sultana continued north, mile after mile, hour after hour. The passengers had no idea how close they were to disaster. Then night came. By the early morning hours of April 27, 1865, most of the people aboard were asleep. The Mississippi River was dark. The ship moved quietly through the night. There were no warning sirens, no modern alarms, no emergency broadcasts. No one knew that within minutes, hundreds of lives would change forever. Then, at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, the night exploded. One of the Sultana's boilers suddenly burst apart. The explosion was enormous. The force tore through the upper part of the steamboat. Wood shattered, metal twisted. The pilot house was destroyed, decks collapsed, and sleeping passengers were suddenly thrown into chaos. Fire erupted across the ship. People woke up screaming. Some were trapped beneath broken timber. Others were thrown directly into the river. Men who had been sleeping peacefully only seconds earlier were now fighting for their lives. There was no time to understand what had happened. There was only one instinct: escape. Get away from the fire. Get to the river. Survive. But for many of the men aboard the Sultana, escaping would be almost impossible. The men had almost nowhere to go. The decks were packed, the ship was burning, and the darkness made everything worse. Imagine waking suddenly in the middle of the night. You hear an explosion. You feel the entire ship shake beneath you. You smell smoke. Then you see fire. People are screaming all around you. Men are pushing toward the exits. But there are thousands of people trying to escape at the same time. There is almost no room to move. Some passengers climbed toward the front of the ship. Others tried to reach the sides. And some simply jumped. They jumped into the Mississippi River without knowing what was waiting below. The water was dark. The current was powerful. And the night was cold. Many of the passengers were already weak from months of imprisonment. Some had lost enormous amounts of weight. Some were sick. Some could barely walk. Now, they were being forced into the river. For those who could swim, the water was still terrifying. For those who could not swim, it was almost certainly deadly. The burning Sultana became a horrifying scene. Flames moved across the wooden structure. Sections of the upper decks collapsed. Burning pieces of wood fell into the water. Smoke filled the air, and everywhere people were calling for help. Some shouted the names of their friends. Some called for their brothers. Others cried out for their families. But there was no way to know who would survive. The men who had spent months dreaming about home were now scattered across the Mississippi River. Some grabbed wooden boards. Some held onto pieces of furniture. Others clung to anything that could float. The wreckage of the ship became their lifeline. A piece of wood could mean the difference between life and death. A few survivors managed to stay together. They tried to help weaker men. They pulled others onto floating debris. Some used pieces of the destroyed ship as makeshift rafts, but the river continued carrying them downstream, and the darkness seemed endless. For hours, many survivors had no idea whether anyone knew what had happened. There was no radio communication. There were no helicopters searching the river. There were no emergency rescue teams waiting nearby. The survivors had only themselves and the river. Somewhere in the darkness, people on shore began to realize that something was terribly wrong. The flames from the burning steamboat could be seen from a distance. Eventually, word began spreading. A disaster had occurred on the Mississippi, and rescue efforts started. Nearby boats moved toward the wreck. One of the vessels involved in the rescue was the Sultana. Its crew worked to pull survivors from the river. They found men clinging to debris. Some were barely conscious. Others were suffering from burns and injuries. Many were too weak to help themselves. The rescuers pulled them from the cold water one by one. But there were far too many people who needed help. The river was still filled with survivors, and every minute mattered. The rescuers continued searching. They moved through the wreckage. They looked for voices in the darkness. They searched for people who were still alive. Some survivors had managed to reach the shore. Others were found floating downstream, and some were rescued from pieces of the destroyed steamboat. As dawn approached, the darkness slowly began to disappear. And with the first light of morning came a terrible realization. The Sultana was gone. What remained was a burning, broken wreck. The Mississippi was filled with debris, and scattered across the river were hundreds of survivors and victims. The scale of the disaster was finally becoming visible. For the men who had survived, the nightmare was not over. Many were injured, many were freezing, many had lost friends, and some were still searching for people they had been traveling with only hours earlier. They had survived the explosion. They had survived the fire. But now, they had to survive the aftermath. And the full story of what had happened aboard the Sultana was only beginning to emerge. As the sun rose over the Mississippi River, rescuers could finally see the terrible scene in front of them. The Sultana had been destroyed. What had been a crowded steamboat only hours earlier was now a burned and broken wreck. Large pieces of the vessel had collapsed into the river. Smoke still rose from parts of the ship. Wooden debris floated across the water. And scattered among that debris were the people who had survived. Some survivors were lying on pieces of wood. Others were clinging to the wreckage. Some had managed to reach the riverbank. Many were injured. Some had burns covering their bodies. Others were suffering from exposure after spending hours in the cold water. And many were simply exhausted. They had been fighting for their lives since the middle of the night. But now, another painful reality was becoming clear. Thousands of people had been aboard the Sultana. More than 1,000 would never see home again. The exact number of people aboard and the exact death toll have been debated by historians because surviving records are incomplete and different sources give different figures. But the scale of the tragedy is not in question. It was one of the worst maritime disasters in American history, and many of the victims were Union soldiers who had only recently been released from Confederate prison camps. These men had survived the Civil War. They had survived imprisonment. They had survived hunger and disease. They had endured months of uncertainty, and they had been so close to going home. Now many of them were dead. The survivors were taken toward Memphis. Hospitals and temporary medical facilities began receiving the injured. Doctors and nurses faced an overwhelming situation. There were burns to treat, broken bones, severe wounds, exhaustion, exposure, and psychological trauma. Many survivors were still trying to understand what had happened. Some had lost friends. Some had lost brothers. Some had watched people disappear beneath the water. And some did not even know whether their loved ones had survived. The disaster also created another problem: identifying the dead. Bodies were recovered from the river over the following days and weeks. Some were badly burned, others had been in the water for hours, and many could not immediately be identified. The Mississippi River carried victims far from the site of the explosion. Bodies were found downstream in different locations. For families waiting in the north, the uncertainty was devastating. They knew their husbands, sons, fathers, and brothers were supposed to be coming home. But instead, they were waiting for news. Some received confirmation of death. Others did not. For some families, the only evidence that their loved one had been aboard the Sultana was a name on a passenger or military record. The emotional damage would last for years. But while families mourned, another question was beginning to dominate public discussion. How had this happened? How could a steamboat carrying so many people have been allowed to travel with a damaged boiler? Why was the vessel so overcrowded? And could the disaster have been prevented? These questions were not simply matters of curiosity. They were questions about responsibility. Because if mistakes had been made, then the Sultana disaster was not simply a terrible accident. It might have been preventable. Investigations began. Officials examined the condition of the ship. They looked at the boilers. They questioned people involved in transporting the soldiers. They examined the circumstances surrounding the overcrowding, and they began trying to determine how such a catastrophic chain of events had been allowed to happen. One of the biggest problems was the condition of the boiler that exploded. Boilers were at the heart of steamboat operation. They produced the steam that powered the vessel.
But when a boiler was damaged or poorly maintained, it could become extremely dangerous. High-pressure steam could turn a mechanical failure into a deadly explosion within seconds. That is exactly what happened aboard the Sultana. The explosion did not simply damage the vessel. It transformed the entire steamboat into a trap. The overcrowding made escape harder. The wooden construction allowed fire to spread, and the darkness meant that many passengers had almost no idea where to go. Every part of the disaster made the next part worse. The damaged boiler led to the explosion. The explosion caused the fire. The fire destroyed escape routes. The overcrowding made escape more difficult, and the nighttime conditions made rescue harder. It was a chain of failures, and at the end of that chain were more than 1,000 dead. But there was another strange part of the story. The Sultana disaster happened at almost exactly the wrong moment in American history. Because while the victims were being pulled from the Mississippi River, the rest of the country was focused on something else, something much bigger, something that had shocked the entire nation only days earlier. The assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. America was still in mourning. And the Sultana disaster was about to become one of the most tragic forgotten stories of the Civil War era. the Civil War era. America was going through one of the most dramatic moments in its history. Only days earlier, President Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. The country was shocked. Millions of Americans were grieving. Newspapers were filled with stories about Lincoln's death, the end of the Civil War, and the uncertain future of the nation. General Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. Confederate armies were collapsing. The war that had divided America for 4 years was finally coming to an end. And in the middle of all of this, the Sultana disaster happened. The timing was almost unbelievable. More than 1,000 people had died. Thousands more had been affected. But the country was already overwhelmed by historic events. The Sultana tragedy was competing for attention with the assassination of a president and the end of a devastating war. As newspapers reported the disaster, the story was shocking, but the national conversation quickly moved on. There was another reason the Sultana story faded. Most of the victims were ordinary people. They were soldiers. They were former prisoners. They were fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands. They were not famous generals. They were not presidents. They were not politicians. They were ordinary Americans returning home after an extraordinary war. And history often remembers famous people more easily than ordinary ones. But for the families of the Sultana victims, these were not ordinary people. They were everything. A wife was waiting for her husband. A mother was waiting for her son. A child was waiting for his father. A brother was waiting for his brother. They believed the war had finally ended. They believed the worst was behind them. Then came the news. Your loved one was aboard the Sultana. The ship exploded. He did not survive. For some families, there was no body to bury. The Mississippi had carried many victims away. Some bodies were recovered days later. Others were never identified. And some may never have been recovered at all. Imagine waiting months for someone to come home. Imagine knowing that the war is over. Imagine hearing that your husband or son has been released from a prison camp. You begin preparing for his return. You imagine seeing him walking through the door. Then, instead of a reunion, you receive news that he died only a short distance from freedom. That was the reality for countless American families. And the story became even more complicated when investigators began examining the circumstances surrounding the ship. There were questions about overcrowding. There were questions about the boiler repairs. There were questions about government transportation contracts. And there were questions about whether greed, carelessness, or poor decisions had contributed to the disaster. Some people believed that the tragedy could have been prevented. Others argued that the explosion was an unfortunate accident. The investigations attempted to determine what had actually happened. But the Sultana disaster was not simply one mistake. It was a series of decisions: a damaged boiler, an overloaded ship, a dangerous river, a nighttime journey, and thousands of people packed aboard a wooden steamboat. Each individual decision may have seemed manageable. Together, they created a catastrophe. And that is one of the most important lessons of the Sultana. Disasters rarely begin with a single dramatic moment. Sometimes they begin with small compromises, a shortcut, a repair that is not done properly, a safety limit that is ignored, a decision to keep moving, and another decision after that, until eventually there is no way back. For the passengers of the Sultana, that moment came at approximately 2 a.m. But for the people responsible for the ship, the disaster may have begun long before the explosion. And that raised an uncomfortable question. If the Sultana had been properly repaired, if fewer passengers had been allowed aboard, if the ship had been inspected more carefully, would more than 1,000 people still be alive? There is no way to know for certain. But the question would remain. And over the years, the Sultana would become surrounded by stories, accusations, and theories. Some were based on evidence. Others were speculation. Separating fact from legend would become increasingly difficult. One theory in particular would capture attention: the possibility that the explosion was not simply an accident. Could someone have deliberately destroyed the Sultana? Could the boilers have been sabotaged? Or was the disaster exactly what it appeared to be? A terrible mechanical failure aboard an overcrowded steamboat. The answer would become part of the mystery surrounding one of America's forgotten tragedies. But before we examine those questions, we need to understand something else. We need to understand just how dangerous steamboat travel was in 19th century America. Because the Sultana was not the first steamboat disaster, and it certainly would not be the last. In the 19th century, the Mississippi River was one of the most important transportation routes in the United States. Steamboats carried people. They carried food. They carried cotton. They carried military supplies. They connected cities and towns across the American interior. But they could also become floating disasters. Boiler explosions were a serious danger, and when a boiler exploded, there was often almost no warning. Passengers could be killed instantly. The wooden vessels could catch fire, and once a steamboat was burning in the middle of a river, escape could become nearly impossible. The Sultana was therefore part of a much larger story. A story about technology, money, risk, and the dangerous race to move people and goods across America's rivers. And when we understand that world, the Sultana disaster begins to make even more sense. Because the tragedy was not just about one ship. It was about an entire system. A system where speed and profit could sometimes matter more than safety. And on one dark night in April 1865, thousands of people paid the ultimate price. But to understand why the Sultana became so dangerously overloaded, we have to look at the world of steamboat travel after the Civil War. The Mississippi River was more than just a river. It was a highway. Before modern railroads connected the country, steamboats were among the fastest ways to move people and supplies through the American interior. They carried everything: cotton, food, mail, military equipment, passengers, and during the Civil War, they became especially important for moving soldiers. The river system was enormous, and controlling transportation along it was a major advantage. But steamboat travel came with serious dangers. The engines were powerful. The boilers operated under tremendous pressure. And if something went wrong, the consequences could be catastrophic. A boiler explosion could destroy a vessel within seconds. There were no modern pressure monitoring systems like those used today. There were no sophisticated computer controls. There were no emergency evacuation procedures comparable to modern standards. And safety regulations were often poorly enforced. For steamboat operators, there was another powerful incentive: profit. A steamboat earned money by carrying passengers and cargo. The more passengers it carried, the more revenue it could generate. That created a dangerous temptation: carry more, move faster, make another trip, and keep the business running. The Sultana was caught inside this system. The recently released prisoners at Vicksburg represented a valuable opportunity. Thousands of soldiers needed transportation, and government contracts were available to companies willing to transport them. The more soldiers a steamboat could carry, the more money could potentially be earned. The Sultana's owners and operators, therefore, had a strong financial reason to take as many passengers as possible. But the soldiers themselves were not thinking about profit. They were thinking about home. They had been prisoners. They had been separated from their families. Some had not seen their loved ones for months. Some did not even know whether their families were still alive. When they were told that transportation north was available, the opportunity was almost impossible to refuse. The Sultana became crowded, then more crowded, and then dangerously overcrowded. Men slept wherever they could find space. Some were on the decks, others were inside the cabins. Many had little room to move. If something went wrong, there would be no easy way for thousands of people to escape at once. And then there was the river. The Mississippi was not calm. Spring floods had caused the water level to rise. The current was powerful. Large amounts of floating debris could make navigation difficult. The river could change. Sandbars could appear. The channel could shift. For an experienced pilot, navigating the Mississippi was a demanding job. For an overloaded steamboat, it was even more difficult. The Sultana continued north. The passengers had no idea how serious the situation had become. They were tired. Many simply wanted to sleep. They had spent months dreaming about reaching home. The war was almost over. Their nightmare seemed to be ending. But beneath the crowded decks, the boilers were working. Steam pressure was building, and one damaged boiler was carrying an enormous burden. Then came the moment that changed everything. The explosion. The force was so powerful that it destroyed much of the upper structure of the ship. The pilot house disappeared. The decks were torn apart. People were thrown from their beds. Some were thrown directly into the river. Others were trapped inside the burning wreckage. And because the vessel was so crowded, escape became a nightmare. A man trying to reach the side of the ship might find dozens of other people blocking his way. Someone falling into the river might take another person with him. A person who could swim might be able to survive. Someone who was sick, injured, or unable to swim had almost no chance. The situation became a brutal struggle for survival. Some survivors later described holding onto pieces of wreckage for hours. Others described seeing people disappear into the darkness. And some survivors were forced to make decisions that no human being should ever have to make. Stay aboard the burning ship, or jump into a dark river. There was no safe option, only different forms of danger. As the hours passed, rescue boats continued searching. But the river was enormous. The survivors were scattered. Some were carried downstream. Others reached the banks. Some remained near the wreck, and some disappeared without anyone ever knowing exactly where they had gone. By sunrise, the scale of the tragedy was becoming impossible to hide. The Sultana had carried thousands. Now, thousands were missing, injured or dead, and the men who had survived were facing another battle, not against an army, not against a prison guard, but against the cold, against exhaustion, against injuries, and against the possibility that no one would find them. For some survivors, the wait would last for hours. For others, the trauma would last for the rest of their lives. The Sultana disaster had ended, but its consequences were only beginning. Its consequences were only beginning. In the days after the disaster, the survivors became living witnesses to what had happened. They carried burns, broken bones, deep wounds, and memories that would never leave them. Many had watched their friends disappear into the Mississippi. Some had seen men trapped inside the burning wreck. Others had spent hours floating in the cold water, holding onto pieces of wood and praying that someone would find them. Now they were alive. But being alive did not mean the nightmare was over. The survivors were taken to Memphis, where doctors and nurses tried to care for them. Many of the men were still extremely weak from their time as prisoners of war. Their bodies had already been damaged by hunger, disease, and exhaustion. The disaster had added another layer of suffering. Some survivors died, even after being rescued. Others spent weeks recovering. And some would carry physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, the search for the dead continued. The Mississippi River had carried bodies far from the wreck. As the days passed, bodies began appearing along the riverbanks. Some were recovered near Memphis. Others were found much farther downstream. Every discovery brought another family closer to learning the fate of a missing soldier. But not everyone could be identified. For many families, there would never be a grave. There would never be a funeral with certainty. There would only be an empty space at the family table, an empty bed, and unanswered questions. The disaster also created an enormous amount of paperwork. Names had to be recorded, survivors had to be identified, deaths had to be documented, military records had to be updated, families had to be notified, and government officials had to determine exactly what had happened. The Sultana had not simply carried civilians. A large percentage of the passengers were Union soldiers who had recently been released from Confederate prison camps. That meant the federal government had a direct interest in understanding the disaster. How had so many soldiers ended up on one steamboat? Who authorized the transportation? Who inspected the ship? Who was responsible for the boiler? And why was the Sultana allowed to continue its journey? These questions became increasingly important. Because if the disaster had been caused by simple bad luck, it was one kind of tragedy. But if negligence had played a role, then people might have been responsible. And there was another question: money. The transportation of released prisoners was not simply a humanitarian operation. Government contracts were involved. Steamboat companies could earn money by carrying soldiers, and the more soldiers they carried, the more money could potentially be made. That created an environment where financial interests could influence decisions. The Sultana was already overloaded, but the pressure to transport soldiers quickly was enormous. The war had ended. Thousands of prisoners were being released. The government wanted to move them north. The soldiers wanted to go home. Steamboat operators wanted to secure profitable contracts, and everyone wanted the process to move quickly. In such an environment, safety could easily become secondary. The Sultana was not supposed to carry thousands of people, yet thousands were aboard. One of the boilers had problems, yet the vessel continued, and the river was difficult to navigate, yet the journey went ahead. Each decision added another layer of risk. Then the explosion turned all of those risks into catastrophe. The investigation would examine these issues, but the public wanted answers immediately. Newspapers reported the disaster, witnesses told their stories, survivors described the explosion, families demanded information, and rumors began spreading. Some rumors were based on facts, others were based on fear, and some were almost impossible to prove. One of the most controversial theories was that the Sultana might have been deliberately sabotaged. The idea was that someone could have placed an explosive device aboard the ship. If true, the disaster would have been something far more sinister than an accident. But theories are not the same as evidence, and separating what people believed from what could actually be proven would become one of the most difficult parts of the Sultana's story. What is clear is that the official investigations focused heavily on the condition of the boilers and the circumstances surrounding the overcrowding. The explosion itself was catastrophic, but investigators needed to understand why the boiler failed. Was it poorly repaired? Was it already damaged? Was the pressure too high? Was the equipment improperly maintained? These were questions that could determine whether the disaster was preventable. And as investigators looked closer, another uncomfortable truth became obvious. The Sultana had been operating under enormous pressure. Not just steam pressure, financial pressure, military pressure, time pressure, and the pressure created by thousands of men desperate to return home. The disaster was therefore more than a mechanical failure. It was the result of a system in which many dangerous conditions existed at the same time. And once those conditions came together, the result was almost impossible to stop. The Sultana burned for hours. The survivors floated in the river. The dead were carried away by the current. And while rescue workers struggled to save whoever they could, the rest of America continued moving forward. The Civil War was ending. Soldiers were returning home. The nation was beginning the difficult process of rebuilding, and slowly, the Sultana began to disappear from the headlines. But for the survivors and the families of the dead, the story was not disappearing. It was only beginning a new chapter, a chapter about memory, responsibility, and the question of why so many lives had been lost when the war itself was already over. When the war itself was already over, that was what made the Sultana disaster so difficult for many families to understand. These men had not died on a battlefield. They had not been killed by enemy soldiers. They had survived the war. They had survived captivity, and they had survived long enough to see freedom. Then, only days before reaching home, they died on a river. For the survivors, that reality was difficult to accept. Some had lost friends they had known throughout the war. Others had lost men they had met only days earlier in prison camps. But there was something they all shared. They had believed the danger was behind them. The Civil War had changed America forever, but it had also created millions of stories that would never appear in history books. The Sultana was one of those stories. The disaster became part of a much larger problem facing the country. How do you bring thousands of soldiers home after a massive war? How do you care for men who are sick and starving? How do you identify the dead? How do you notify families? And how do you rebuild a nation while so many people are still grieving? These questions were everywhere in 1865. America was entering Reconstruction. The country had to deal with the destruction caused by 4 years of war. Cities needed rebuilding. Railroads needed repair. Families needed to reconnect. And millions of formerly enslaved people were beginning a new and uncertain chapter of freedom. In the middle of this enormous transformation, the Sultana disaster received less and less attention. Other stories dominated the newspapers. Political battles were beginning. The future of the South was being debated. The assassination of Lincoln remained one of the biggest stories in the nation, and the Sultana gradually became yesterday's news. But the families did not forget. For them, the disaster had a name, a face, a voice, a missing person, a son who never returned, a husband who never walked through the front door, a father whose children would grow up without him. And for decades, survivors continued telling their stories. Some described the explosion. Some remembered the flames. Some remembered the cold water. Some remembered holding on to pieces of wood. And some remembered the people they could not save. These personal memories became important because official records could tell only part of the story. A government document could record a name. A newspaper could record a death. But only a survivor could explain what it felt like to wake up inside a burning ship. Only a survivor could describe the darkness of the Mississippi. Only a survivor could explain what it meant to spend hours believing that rescue might never come. These stories helped keep the Sultana alive. But as the decades passed, fewer and fewer people remembered the disaster. The survivors grew older, then they died. Their children grew old, and eventually, the first-hand memories disappeared. The Sultana became a story from another century, a tragedy hidden inside the enormous history of the Civil War. Yet the ship itself remained. For years, the wreckage and remains of the vessel were slowly swallowed by the Mississippi River and its changing landscape. The river did what rivers always do. It moved. It changed its course. It buried evidence. And it carried pieces of the past away. Over time, the exact location of the wreck became uncertain. For generations, the Sultana seemed almost lost, but historians continued searching for evidence. Documents were studied, newspaper reports were examined, survivor accounts were compared. and researchers tried to reconstruct what happened during those final hours. The more they learned, the more complicated the story became. The Sultana was not simply a ship that exploded.
It was a tragedy involving technology, transportation, government contracts, human decisions, and the chaos of a nation emerging from war. And perhaps that is why the story matters. Because history often teaches us about famous battles, famous generals, presidents, wars, treaties. But sometimes the most powerful history is found in the lives of ordinary people. The men aboard the Sultana were not trying to change history. They were simply trying to go home. They wanted to see their families. They wanted to eat a normal meal. They wanted to sleep in their own beds. They wanted to put the war behind them. And that makes the tragedy even more painful. They were so close. Many of them had already survived the hardest part. The enemy had surrendered. The war was ending. Freedom had finally arrived. But freedom was not enough to guarantee that they would survive the journey home. And that is one of the cruelest lessons of the Sultana. Sometimes surviving the war does not mean surviving its aftermath. Sometimes the greatest danger appears when you believe the danger is finally gone. For the passengers of the Sultana, that danger arrived in the middle of the night. And when morning came, more than 1,000 lives had been lost. But there was still one mystery surrounding the disaster that continued to attract attention. Why did the boiler explode? Was the mechanical failure caused by poor repairs? Was the ship pushed beyond its limits? Or was something more deliberate involved? For more than a century, these questions would continue to surround the Sultana. And to understand them, we need to look closely at the final hours before the explosion. Because the story of the Sultana did not begin when the boiler burst. The warning signs had appeared much earlier. The warning signs had appeared much earlier. Before the Sultana left Vicksburg, there were already reasons for concern. The ship was crowded, the river was difficult, and one of the boilers had a history of trouble. The boiler that eventually exploded had developed a leak. Instead of replacing the damaged section completely, repairs were made so the ship could continue its journey. That decision would later become one of the most important details in the entire story. A boiler is not simply a large metal container. It is a pressure vessel. Inside, water is heated until it becomes steam. That steam creates enormous pressure. That pressure powers the engines. But if the metal becomes weakened, or if the pressure rises beyond what the boiler can safely withstand, the result can be catastrophic. A boiler does not need to slowly fall apart. It can fail in seconds. And when it does, the energy released can destroy everything around it. That is what happened aboard the Sultana. But the passengers knew almost nothing about the mechanical problems. They were soldiers. Many were exhausted. They were not engineers. They had no reason to inspect the machinery. They trusted the people operating the ship, and most importantly, they believed they were finally going home. The Sultana continued north. The men settled in as best they could. Some slept, some talked, some watched the river, others simply waited. They had already endured months of uncertainty. A few more hours seemed like nothing. But beneath the decks, the machinery was working constantly. Steam pressure was building, the repaired boiler was being pushed, and the ship was carrying an enormous human load. The river also created another challenge. The Mississippi was in flood. The water level was unusually high. The current was powerful, and large amounts of debris were moving through the river. The Sultana had to navigate carefully. For the crew, it was a difficult journey. For the passengers, however, the danger was largely invisible. They saw only the river. They felt the movement of the ship. They heard the engines. And then they tried to sleep. Nobody aboard knew that the next few hours would become the final hours of their lives. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, the explosion came. The boiler suddenly failed. The force was devastating. The upper decks were destroyed. The pilot house was blown away.
Fire spread rapidly, and the crowded passengers were thrown into chaos. The darkness disappeared behind flames. Men screamed, some tried to run, others were trapped, some jumped, and some simply froze. There was almost no time to think. The ship was burning, the river was below, and thousands of people were trying to escape. For those who reached the water, another battle began. The Mississippi was cold, the current was strong, and many survivors were already physically weak. Some had never learned to swim. Others were wearing heavy clothing. Some were injured by the explosion. Others had burns. Yet they had to keep themselves above the surface. They grabbed boards, pieces of wood, furniture, anything that floated. Some survivors formed small groups. They tried to help each other. They pulled exhausted men onto pieces of wreckage. They shared whatever little strength they had left. But the river continued carrying them downstream. Some survivors were separated from their friends. Others lost sight of their brothers. Some called out names in the darkness. There was no answer. The burning ship behind them slowly became smaller. The flames reflected across the surface of the Mississippi, and the survivors waited. They waited for rescue. They waited for daylight. They waited to find out whether anyone knew where they were. Some would later describe those hours as the longest of their lives. The river seemed endless. The night seemed endless. And every minute brought another question. Would they survive? Would rescue come? Would they ever see their families again? For some, the answer would be yes. For many others, it would be no. As the night continued, rescue boats began moving toward the disaster. People along the river heard the news. Search efforts expanded. The survivors who were strong enough tried to move towards safety. Some reached the riverbank. Others were pulled from the water by rescuers. The rescue crews worked through the darkness and into the morning. But the destruction was enormous. By daylight, the truth could no longer be hidden. The Sultana had become a floating graveyard. The wreckage was scattered across the river. Survivors were everywhere. Bodies were everywhere. And the men who had boarded the ship believing they were finally returning to normal life were now victims of one of America's greatest forgotten disasters. Yet even after the rescue, another story was beginning. A story about responsibility. A story about whether anyone should have been held accountable. And a story about how a disaster of this size could almost disappear from American memory. The Sultana had become a tragedy, but history was about to decide whether it would become a famous tragedy or a forgotten one. For more than a century, the Sultana slowly disappeared from the memory of the nation. The Civil War became part of American history. The names of generals were remembered. The battles were studied. Presidents were honored. But the thousands of ordinary people aboard one Mississippi River steamboat were gradually forgotten. Yet their story never truly disappeared. Because history is not only made by presidents and generals. History is also made by ordinary people. By soldiers who survived wars. By families waiting at home. By men who dreamed of seeing their children again. And by people whose lives ended in moments that nobody expected. The men aboard the Sultana were not looking for fame. They were not trying to become part of history. They simply wanted to go home. They had survived the Civil War. They had survived prison camps. They had endured hunger, sickness, fear, and uncertainty. They had watched friends disappear. And when the war finally ended, they believed their suffering was over. For many of them, home was only a few days away. Then, in the darkness of April 27, 1865, everything changed. A boiler exploded, the ship caught fire, the decks collapsed, and thousands of lives were thrown into the Mississippi River. Some survived by holding on to pieces of wreckage. Some were rescued, and many never came out of the river. More than 1,000 people lost their lives. But the tragedy was quickly overshadowed by the enormous events happening across America. The country was mourning Abraham Lincoln. The Civil War was ending. The future of the United States was uncertain, and the Sultana became yesterday's news. But forgetting a tragedy does not make it less important. And being forgotten does not mean that those lives mattered less. Every person aboard that ship had a story. Someone loved them. Someone was waiting for them. Someone expected them to come home. That is perhaps the most powerful lesson of the Sultana. When we look at historical numbers, it is easy to forget what those numbers represent. 1,000 deaths is a number, but one death is a person, a father, a son, a husband, a brother, a friend. And behind every name was a family whose life changed forever. The Sultana also reminds us that disasters rarely happen because of one single decision. They often happen when several problems come together: an overloaded vessel, a damaged boiler, a difficult river, pressure to move quickly, and decisions made under difficult circumstances. One problem might not have caused a catastrophe by itself, but together they created something deadly. That lesson remains relevant even today. Technology becomes more advanced, transportation becomes safer, communication becomes faster, but human decisions still matter. Safety still matters, and the consequences of ignoring warning signs can still be enormous. The Sultana is therefore more than an old story from 1865. It is a reminder that people can become forgotten, a reminder that tragedies can disappear beneath the weight of bigger events, and a reminder that history is worth looking at from more than one direction. We remember the Civil War, we remember its battles, we remember its generals, but we should also remember the people who were simply trying to survive it. The Sultana carried many of those people, and for a brief moment, their lives were connected on one crowded steamboat traveling north through the Mississippi. They were strangers, soldiers, friends, brothers, fathers. They had different lives and different homes, but that night, they shared the same fate. When the sun finally rose over the Mississippi River, the Sultana was no longer a ship carrying soldiers home. It was a wreck, a symbol of tragedy, and a reminder of how quickly hope can turn into disaster. Today, the Sultana is remembered by historians, researchers, descendants, and people who continue to tell its story. And perhaps that is the most important thing we can do. Remember, because when we remember the forgotten, they are no longer forgotten. The men aboard the Sultana never reached the homes they had dreamed about. Many never saw their families again, but more than a century later, their story can still reach us. Across the years, across the river, across history. And perhaps tonight, you have heard their story for the first time. A story about war, a story about survival, a story about loss, and a story about thousands of people who believed they were finally going home. They never made it, but their story did. And as the Mississippi continues to flow, carrying the memory of generations past, the name of the Sultana remains a quiet reminder of one of America's most forgotten tragedies. This was the Sultana disaster, and this is why we remember. Because sometimes, the stories history forgets are the stories we most need to hear.